Today, I would like to focus on the subtitle of our show, which is the 20th line. According to Shams Tabrizi, in a conversation with the great poet and mystic Rumi sometime in the 13th century, quote, "The third line embodies the otherness of the other, something there but unreadable." I brought together a few figures from the third line's adjacent timeline and a few more who are shaping the Gulf's cultural present. They represent different generational, disciplinary, and creative perspectives. They're all highly respected for what they represent and how they've conjured this. If, as the old Soviet joke quoted by our dear friend Slavs and Tatars goes, quote, "The future is certain, it is only the past which is unpredictable." What lines can be drawn between then, now, and there? So with that, I would like to start with my first two guests, and we will then be joined by our second two guests in about roughly 25 minutes time. We have two people here that are extremely dear, not only to me, but I'm sure to many of you here. And, you know, when you use that cliche, they really need no introduction. This is one of those moments where that is true. But will you please join me in welcoming Hussein Kazim and Rami Farouk. It's obvious now how fast Dubai was changing in the 2000s. Over there we have these beautiful pictures by Fuad al-Khoury, by Tariq al-Hussein, and these are photographs that capture that tender moment between what was and what was to come. I'd like to ask you both, growing up here, did it always feel like Dubai was a place of accelerated change? Or did this become noticeable at a particular moment in either the city's lives or your lives? Rami, could we start with you? Did Dubai always feel like a place that was changing very quickly?
No, not really. I think 80s were quite mellow, early 90s as well. I think the first changes happened when Sheikh Zayed Road started getting built and we started seeing those towers. Not even Trade Center, because Trade Center was way before that, right? And then I think the big one, the moment of Dubai's arrival and change must have been Burj Al Arab. I think that was the moment that we entered not only a change here, but also a global change. You know, I remember I was in the States starting uni in 98, and that's how people knew Dubai.
You were born in 1981. What are your memories of transformation here and the arrival particularly of, you know, what we might call symbols of modernity, like shopping malls and those kinds of things?
Yeah, so I think 80s in that sense was Al Ghurair Center. Everyone, that was the start. And then maybe Burjuman and Wafi, and then the first city center opened. So this is in terms of where people shopped and hung out and so on. But then I think of Jumeirah Road as another point of change in a way, where these where we would walk from, let's say, Beach Center to the ones on the other side, you know. So then there were a few parks that were starting to open up. So it was a very simple life. The development was mainly in these sort of spaces, either public, you know, where there was a bit of beach or parks, or these little malls before the bigger ones happened.
It was also called Jumeirah Beach Road, if you remember.
Jumeirah Beach, exactly.
Which also meant that you could see the beach.
Exactly.
Like the beach was visible. I think that's the kind of pivotal transition. The moment you stopped being able to see the water is when Dubai really changed. That was my memory of the city going up and down what was known as the starting point called Russian Beach, which was, you know, which turned into La Merde, and then J1 now and whatever else it's going to be, all the way up to eventually leading up to Burj Al Arab. But you could see for the most part, because it was all fishing villages, essentially, historically, right? So these were like low-rise, buyut shabia, like government housing that were beachfront property because it belonged to folks that were part of that economy. And, you know, our childhood excursions were driving into those neighborhoods directly onto the beach, typically in a 4x4, and, you know, sitting on the kasarat, the wave breakers. And that was the relationship to the city. So we were very aware of the fact that we were in a coastal place, you know, that had a relationship to trade, that had a relationship to seafaring, had a relationship to the spirits of the sea, to the dangers of the sea. And I think that part has sort of disappeared. There is a moment that we're entering now for developers where there's this like obsession with beach clubs. Like suddenly there's like beach clubs everywhere. So I think now we're like realizing, oh, actually, you know what? We're here. We're on this coast. Like let's monetize it.
Before Burj Al Arab opened, where did the center of Dubai feel like?
Trade center.
Really?
Yeah. For me, it was Trade Center. It was like that was a skyscraper.
Yeah. I felt kind of maybe Bur Dubai was the center at that time. I know that there was Jumeirah and Trade Center, but it felt like it was still, that was the edge of the city.
What about the creek, the original creek? Did that play a role in your lives, or was that already somewhere kind of distant?
For me, it did, because the family business was in Bur Dubai at the time until the 90s. And so, yeah, near the Fahidi Fort, near the creek. So, yeah, it kind of did.
For me, it was like, we had graduated from the Shandara Bardbay Creek relationship, but you were very aware of its significance and your lineage from it, in terms of prosperity, experience, living circumstances as well, because people moved from the creek to, in my case, like Satwa or Al Badr, which is like the first entry into like Jumeirah and what is known as Bar Dubai. They weren't also easily, kind of traversed, those two sort of geographies. And I think the creek was always this sort of return to the origins, return to how like migration happened, return to like where our families, may have come from or had worked or made their livelihood, which then enabled us to go to the private schools and move, further inland and, and be where we are now. So there was this very clear sort of narrative. Now it's a completely disrupted and demolished memory. So that's, I guess.
And that sense of Dubai being a place of rapid change, when did that start to register in your consciousness?
I'll tell you something about the creek. Like, this is a very clear memory for me. When the Kuwait, the Americans, came into Kuwait to liberate it, people went out onto the abras in the creek and they were like singing "Free Kuwait" on the abras, like carrying Kuwaiti flags. So there was this also like political sort of dimension to the creek that may have not been part of the history.
Yeah.
In that way.
Let's fast forward a little bit now into the 2000s, maybe early 2000s. Were either of you interested in art back then? And if so, where could you go and see art at that time?
Shopping malls.
Shopping malls?
Yeah.
Tell us.
There was like folks who would organize. I mean, there's a Dubai Art Center, which is still around.
What was that? What's this?
The Dubai International Art Center. So it's actually like, a beautiful house, a villa in Jumeirah 1. They moved locations, but for me, it was the original idea of like, having a gallery space and where you could learn how to paint and draw and like, engage with art. That was where a lot of what was known as the Jumeirah Jane trope, also like went and, spent time and, and taught. So that was like this villa and it had a gallery space. It was a home. So it was founded by someone called, I forgot her name, but it was effectively, British and Pakistani and Emirati women that were running this place and curating it and, running workshops from decoupage to like acrylic. And then they would have exhibitions in malls, like, in the first floor, second floor of a strip mall or like a beach center or Jumeirah Plaza or a hotel, and they would be framed elaborately. And this was a time where, like, you would have a show by Abdul Qadir Reis happening in a similar kind of setting, and a show by, like Deborah Abu Saad, for example, who is somebody who's a friend, like a friend's mom, who is like creating these beautiful Algerian kind of decoupage pieces. That was like how you encountered art. Do you
remember what kind of art would be shown there?
Painting, primarily.
But Arab, local?
Yeah, it was a hybrid regional. The stuff that made it into Emirates Airlines, like lounges, the stuff that made it into the original, like Dubai Beach, the Jumeirah Beach hotel. Like when, hotel developers started coming in, they would go to these, centers or to the artists, and buy in bulk. And some of them, like if you go to the Emirates Lounge in Terminal 3, that you'll still have some of that art. Like you still have some of the original art that probably lived in an Emirates like pilot's house as well as in the lounge. And that was a very recognizable, elaborate desert framed, sort of bull frame with gold leaf mat, and then like layers and layers of mat, and then there's the artwork in the middle. And and it was everywhere. And that it was like jewelry, it was camels, it was della, it was, that like we are in the Gulf.
Rami, I wanted to ask you because, Sharjah's history with culture and with art even really goes way back. Fine Arts Society is there in the early 80s. The biennial, I think a lot of people forget, started in 1993. Would you ever make your way to Sharjah to immerse yourself in any of the contemporary art and culture in Sharjah at the time?
I would, but honestly, at that time, nobody really had art on their radar, even as kids, right? Even though my high school at the time was in Sharjah, and so I'd be there all the time. I'd see ads for the Biennale, and maybe I went once or twice, but no, not really. Also, at that period in my life, I was mostly into maybe film, and later on it was music.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really the visual arts that came later on.
So then bringing us to, this important moment when the third line begins. I don't know do either of you remember so some of the shows that Sunny did very early on, were in hotels. If either of you saw any of those shows that Sunny did early on, but also if you remember when the third line opened, November 2005, in a building just on the other side of the road here. Can you say something about those first memories or interactions you had with Sunny, with Qari, with Omar, and with the third line?
I mean, for me, it's like funny because I'm sitting next to Rami, and to me, traffic came first in my experience. Yeah, but to me, like to my encounter, because I was living in Canada at the time, and I was a graphic designer, so I came back and there's traffic, so I was super excited, and they were doing a screening of 𝐓𝐇𝐄, and I was like, what is this place? And this is like here, the original place. So then I would go on this, I went on this discovery tour when I came back, trying to find what are these galleries, and it was Society magazine that had done a piece on these galleries that are opening up in Dubai, and this is a whole new city, that I'm coming back to.
How long had you been gone away for?
4.5 years. But I mean, I would go back and forth, but I mean, this didn't become front and center of the conversation until around 2005. That was the first time we're seeing the visibility of these spaces. And there was also a new language to it. And this was at the same time as Bedouin. So I'm studying Bedouin in school. I'm looking at Alif, which was a very short-lived stint, right? I think Canvas came a little later. Brown Book is trying to do its thing. So there's all this sudden impulse to publish and create and tell and give a voice. And I'm working on this side university project called Zain Magazine. And it's the same idea, this thirst to represent our region, So there's IBDE, the original IBD, which was called B21, traffic. I'm doing the tour. And then there's third line. And this is a dark moment, in Dubai, because there's literally no illumination in this area of the city. You're kind of trying to figure out where these warehouses are. You have the one light box that's out there, lighting up the facade with the aluban, kind of cladding. And, your space, which was, I came back and it was there is something happening. There's a moment. And I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's, it's exciting. And everybody's and there's AUS, I think, at the same time. AUS is doing incredible work in graphic design. There is suddenly the, what's her name? The designer, Rania, the one who started doing Arab pop art. So it was suddenly the aesthetic of the mid 2000s, Arab pop art was everywhere, every restaurant, every, bag, and there was Sarah's bag in Lebanon. So there's all of these things. Tariq Atrisi, the guy who the designer who created the Qatar logo, the official Qatar logo. So all of that was part of the same moment, and all of it came out of this impulse to make Arabic visible, whether it meant calligraphy, whether it meant 𝐬𝐫𝐵, whether it meant the Arabic pop art stuff, and then, folks who were engaging with it more deeply and intellectually.
Actually, and that's a perfect segue because Rami, I first meet you in 2007. You bring me over to do a talk, what I believe is the first of many spaces that you go on to found, which we'll talk about shortly. 𝐓𝐇𝐄 just mentioned this one, which is traffic. So what was traffic then, and why was traffic happening?
So traffic started off as originally meant to be a design gallery with a library, and then it grew to become a bit of a studio space, a bit of a space for activations, exhibitions, and talks, and it became like, mashallah, a very active, energetic hub, both for art and design. So that's when the residencies started, also for different artists. The competition started, the hosting of different universities to have their grad shows, to hosting international museums like the Vitra Museum to do their exhibitions, of course the film screenings, because really we didn't have anything at the time. Like 𝐓𝐇𝐄 mentioned, we only had these 3 spaces as the third line in B21, and I don't know, maybe at the time I was just a bit energetic and excited, and I had a great bunch around me, like Sadia and Shahab, who are in the audience now as well. Of course, you were around too, and then we started doing things together. But we also then expanded beyond just our space. So we ended up doing 𝐓𝐄𝐄 𝐓𝐇𝐄 in collaboration with the third line. And also on the note of the third line, I remember the first time walking into it, summer 2006, while they were installing the show, and the first artwork I bought for the collection was from the third line in January 2007. So
How did it feel like walking into that space at the time?
Very different, because there was no space, first of all, in Dubai that had concrete floors and white walls, which now we're kind of like, khalas, it's like, it's a fact.
That's why I got, there are no white walls here.
Yeah.
Because they're everywhere now, right?
So
The 𝐁𝐿𝐴
the 𝐁𝐿𝐴 ceiling, exactly. It was.
And I think it's important to, it'd be nice to know, about your father, your family, what line of business you mentioned. You were, the family office has been in Dubai before, because in a way, your trajectory, is not the trajectory that would have been planned for you. I think you both represent a generation that decided that the script that would often be given to children, particularly children of families that had family businesses, you were going to make your own script. But Rami, tell us something, because your father is an extraordinary person and the company is an extraordinary thing.
Thank you. Yeah, so the family business, it started off as stationery, and Dad had different jobs before, including working in the library in Dubai, and then working in the courts and in the Ministry of Interior, before working in his family business, and then deciding to start his own stationery shop. And that stationery shop grew to multiple, alhamdulillah, to then factories and so on, with like hundreds of employees, and now exporting to like, 60, 70 countries. Then I got into that business, and I did that for 5 years, and I grew within the company, and until I managed around 100, 150 people. But within that period, there were 2 things. I had just come back from the States, where I was very active in actually rave culture of the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I came back, and my free time was just buying vinyl and making music, and all that we did was go to each other's houses and spinning records, just for a small group of us that was doing that at the time. There was also a bit of film again. But in the family business, I realized I love publishing, because again, it's stationery and so on, and I loved designing. And so I think that's from where it kind of came about. And the family was very supportive. I actually made some money saved from working in the family business, that I then decided that I'm going to start traffic and so on. And they were supportive, because they also have a bit of an artistic thing within them, this both of my parents. And
amazing.
Yeah.
Butena, Sunny and Claudia used to put on film screenings in the first few years of the third line. Curious whether you attended any of these. Was there anywhere else for a cinema lover to go and meet other cinema lovers at that time?
I mean, cinema was alive and well in Dubai. I mean, we had a different formula. So, the first cinemas opened in the 60s, including the Golden Cinema, whose chairs we have held for safekeeping. Nassau Cinema, I don't know how many people in this room probably have, frequented. It's how we cut our teeth. I mean, it's how we also went on dates and how we discovered the big screen, and ran away for air conditioning. Like, that was the relationship to cinema. So it existed. It didn't necessarily mean it was art house per se, but it was and mostly Bollywood, like 90s Hollywood stuff that you had access to. So the Yash Raj era was, ingrained in everybody's mind. The DDLJ, that soundtrack, like, it was a big part of, coming of age here. And then the arrival of the multiplexes, right? And the Dera City Center opening up, and then the Grand Cinema, this Grand Cineplex next to the Hyatt Regency, that was another space. So cinemas were around, but if you were interested in anything to do with, documentary film or art house or even experimental, video art and so on, there were pockets, there were, galleries that were doing it. There was something called Mahmovies by Mahmoud Kabur, who's a filmmaker. He made a film called Being Osama, and then Teta Alf Marra and Chant for the Camp. Now works in like museum spaces. And I think, he was one of the kind of original dedicated series creators of art house cinema programming, and it was free. It was at the Jam Jar Gallery where you could watch a lot of those films. I think a lot of it also happened, like Rami was describing, like in people's homes, So it was your Laserdisc collection, and then later, DVD collection, or I think that's where people learned, about what they're interested in and, kind of taught each other. The private sphere was like a central point that I think the third line was born out of. Like, there was a private club, of friends and what school you went to. And that's the trajectory, right? Is that private schools, which meant that you had access to, the ability to end up, speaking with a vaguely American twang or, adopted British accent, like, meant that you were part of a handful of people who had access to that kind of education, So those became clubs. Those became ways of creating, community and alumni, that would then create, together, that would go to each other's houses, that would go to each other's compounds, that became part of each other's lives. So if you look at the original stories of a lot of these, galleries, including this one that we celebrate, they come from that history and that kind of that tight-knit relationship. So I've been thinking a lot about, the title of your show. And I also think like the only ones near are few, like that's something that's the continuity of it, is that there is a closed circuit that's still reliant on trust that started from trust. So this place and the longevity of this place is born out of trust. And, folks like Rami and the things that have been created out of their spaces have a lot to do with that trust. And we kind of, like with Cinema 𝐓𝐇𝐄, like infiltrated, that space and eventually had to build my own circle of trust. And that's a very big part of the Dubai story, I think, that sometimes gets disappeared in the process, is that sort of sense of real urgency to find that trust and care in community to be able to create.
And actually on that, before I ask Rami about the sort of next major project that he undertook, the origin myth of Cinema 𝐓𝐇𝐄, I believe, is sort of genealogically connected to the third line. Can you tell us how your professional paths intertwined and how the third line became an inspiration for you as you became a founder yourself of your own cultural project here?
I mean, look, there is a 3-part essay that Hind Vizena wrote about the kind of relationship or history of cinemas and cinema going in the UAE that's very robust. And I would recommend that everybody check it out, because she really goes into where, these kind of disparate screenings started, cine clubs, and then later, cinema Akil. But again, I think it comes back to this idea of trust, right? So I entered the space a little later, like a lot of these things were coming to fruition. To me, the Dubai kind of, conveyor belt experience started in 2003. It was the IMF World Bank meetings, Dubai World 2003, all the entities that were like set up at that time to Dubai Internet City, Dubai Media City, those like original free zones.
Mm-hmm.
That was the moment that Dubai became fast. That's the moment that change became a part of our lived experience. And so what that meant for me as somebody who left and came back like 2008 is that I saw a lot of things kind of pieced together while I was away. So a lot of things grew up and took shape and created spaces. And I wanted to be a part of it in different ways. And I wasn't really sure how. And I was working in television at that time, doing acquisitions. And I, pitched this project, this television channel, Pan-Arab television channel that was meant to reach 360 million viewers like across the Arab world, because that's how satellite television worked here. And at that time, it was 96% penetration in terms of being the kind of most effective channel for the Arab world. So the short idea was that we're going to create a channel that taps into all of this stuff that's happening. So the magazines are doing their thing, the spaces are doing their thing. We're going to create a TV channel that, positions Dubai. And it was at the same time, the same group as MTV Arabia and Nickelodeon. So there was a lot of that interest. So MTV was kind of creating its own, language around what the Arab world should look like. And this was a version of it. So we recorded an episode, and I have to find this. It's not like one day I'm going to find someone who can digitize the copies of the SD cam recordings of the Third Line's original story. So we interviewed the Third Line, and we interviewed folks that were doing the stuff, trying to make sense of it, trying to make shows that would be broadcast, to the rest of the region. The channel never took off because the financial crisis followed. So that meant that I had this repository, and I was also buying films. So the first film I bought was Anne-Marie Jassid's لما شفتك, not لما شفتك, ملح هذا البحر, or Salt of the Sea. And I had all these films, that I was trying to show the rest of the Arab world in DVD format, that would never make it to broadcast anymore. So I individually wrote to, the distributors, asking them for permission to show the films. The very broad range. I had Mohsen Mahmal Baf, I had Asghar Farhadi's original, Bahman Ghabadi's Salt, Time for Drunken Horses. It was a weird, collection of DVDs from all these distributors from the Marché du Film, Cannes. And they said, sure, and at the time it was Shelter that, had a screening space. It was 45 seats or something. Really uncomfortable, beautiful space. And, we started just showing the films, one screening at a time. And it didn't have a name. It didn't have a Cinema Akil name per se. And I loved doing that. I loved the conversation adjacent to the art world that was being kind of ricocheted off of the films, and the worlds of the artists that were being opened up through the film screenings. A film like Gabbé, about the carpets, completely, sort of taking life through the artwork that is being showcased at the Third Line or other spaces around. So there was the synergy that was direct. And it was free, and I wasn't making money. I was working, so this was a side, interest. So then I kept doing that, and I kept trying to pursue it in more formal ways. There was the Pavilion, if you remember that, the Pavilion in downtown, which was, the sales center for the Dubai Opera.
Yeah.
And they had this beautiful space, also run by Ahmed and Rashid bin Shabib, and the Third Line, actually, because they had they had an exhibition space. And that was a moment that fell through the cracks somehow. That was an actual exhibition space that was brilliant, and it was the real white walls. There was no chinko. It was fully built. It was a Mars spec, with the landscaping outside and everything, and parking. So, we're in the major leagues now, and we have this space. So we're doing screenings at that space, and I get the Abu Dhabi Film Festival. So Dubai Film Festival is happening. It's now alive and well. It's midway. Abu Dhabi Film Festival is also thriving. They're competing for, which Hollywood stars going to walk their red carpet. They're paying exorbitant fees, to rights holders for their film premieres. And in between, there's us, right? There's like 10 days here, 10 days there. And I convinced the Abu Dhabi Film Festival to give me their award-winning films to show, in Dubai. So it becomes Abu Dhabi Film Festival at the Pavilion. So I started doing this, and then eventually there comes the name of Cinema Aqib, and I sit down across from Sunny at the steakhouse in the Regency. What is it called? The one in the Endera? Was it the Regency or the Hyatt Regency? Was that the one? Yeah. So there was a steakhouse, a famous steakhouse that was like a big part of Dubai lives. And I asked her, she's like, hey, why don't you do this? Like, why don't we do something with at the third line with your films? And that's how it started. It was a very quick, trust-based, complete risk appetite, let's do it. And it was the summer show. And that was the first thing held under the name Cinema Aqil. So that's my long-winded timeline of how Cinema Aqil came to be an official name and a screening platform. And through that, we showed Pablo Larraín's No. We showed the time, we showed at the first of the Apu trilogy, Pater Panchali. We had talks by, Ligia, Raja Khalid, Mohammed Khawaja, who would introduce the films. And we opened also with Anne-Marie Jass's Lama Shuftak. So yeah, that's how we started. And we just kept going.
Amazing, thank you. And before we move on to the next part, Rami, I wanted to ask you about the fact that after Traffic, you become perhaps one of the most unconventional gallerists there's ever been in the history of gallerists. Tell us about Satellite, who it drew together, and whether Sunny and Claudia ever gave you any advice on how to run a gallery.
So what happened is in 2008, one artist introduced me to another called James Clark, actually at the third line, because we were hosting a Pecha Kucha there. And James Clark, this artist who was visiting, asks me to do a residency, which at the time I didn't even know what an artist residency is. Fast forward, we end up having this residency. We give him his first show. He asks me to represent him. Again, I had no intention to become a gallerist, to represent anyone. I say sure. So for 2 years, I literally represent just this one artist. We end up doing a solo for him at Art Dubai 2010. I get invited to curate Edge of Arabia Berlin, this exhibition of Saudi artists during the Berlin Biennale. After that exhibition, all these Saudi artists, we had such a great experience and experiment, and they asked me to represent them. And these are people you know now, like Ahmed Matar, Ayman Yusri, Abdel Nasser Haram. So I guess, okay, cool, yeah, I'll represent you guys. Let's see what it will do. And we start having these different exhibitions within the space, which is now Traffic 2.0, which is like this 10,000 square foot warehouse we renovated in El Goz, having all these world shows, including the state, which was a mixture from my collection and also commissions from artists. And then we needed another space that was going to be even more experimental to host things called broadcasts and to have artist studios and storage and so on. And this is where Satellite came about. And alhamdulillah, it still exists 15 years later. So did Sunny and Claudia ever give me advice? No, because I think that they were just amused by what I was doing. As was I, but we collaborated. Like I actually curated a 2-part show that started here on a Wednesday in November 2011 and then continued with same theme, different artists in Traffic. And there was always music, there was always food. Very special times. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you so much. We'll come back to Rami and Buthaina in part 3, but I now would like to introduce my next 2 guests. We have Sarah bin Safwan. She's a curator at Guggenheim Abu Dhabi and co-founded Salasil, an experimental curatorial studio. She's curated in London, Beirut, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. And Sarah Alayan is a Palestinian-Jordanian writer who's currently deputy editor at Dazed, MENA. She's a recent transplant to Dubai and prefers the cold, wet winters of London to whatever we have here outside. Will you please join me in welcoming Sarah and Sarah? I wanted to, as a baton moment, curious to ask you both, obviously very different generations, maybe very different kind of experiences to what we've just heard from Butena and Rami, but I'm curious how both of you feel when you're inside the show, and what kind of reactions has it given? I know you've been here before. I think you've both been to the shows before, right? So Sarah, maybe I could start with you. How does it feel like being in this show?
It feels very momentous, I would say. It just kind of really also reflective to come in and recognize many of the artists and just to see them all together, and then also reflect back on, wow, like so much has happened and we've come such a long way, and it's really amazing. And then in parallel to that, seeing all of the parallel histories also with each other through the conversations, through the artists' works as well. So it's it's a lot to take in, I would say, but also just what an amazing feat, and just to think about all of the things that Third Line has done and been a part of this community and the narrative building, kind of the art scene in the UAE, which I was watching from afar in Abu Dhabi, and then coming to Dubai, to witness all of this, and then when Sirkal kind of blew up and everything, and just to see all the growth of that. So I would say it's a really nice full circle moment.
It's amazing. And we'll obviously talk a lot about shortly about what you're doing now back in Abu Dhabi, and what this tells us about where we go next. Sarah, as I said, very recent transplant. You've done a year here now.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily, I don't know what your relationship to Dubai was before, if you'd spent any time here, etc. But it's fair to say you're relatively,
new.
very, very new. And I'm curious how, I think, again, for people who've been here a long time, they will naturally have all kinds of like memory travels when they're in this space. But somebody who is like yourself, much more recent to this environment, what does it feel like to be in something like this?
I mean, I think definitely feels very momentous. For me, this exhibition itself felt quite extraordinary. Like, I don't think I've been to an exhibition like this before that felt just so active, and also tapped into a kind of memory that I didn't know I had. I think there's something about the space itself without the white walls that felt kind of overstimulating in a sense.
In a good way?
In a really good way, because it felt very, like I said, active and alive and uncertain, while also very provocative. And I think that's exactly what I look for when I go to exhibitions, something that feels like it extends beyond itself. It feels very, very much like a rhizome, I think. And the Third Line in general, for me, has been almost like a safe haven, I guess, to Dubai, or being in Dubai. I feel like I didn't really know what Dubai was about. I visited a couple times when I was younger, and I think the art scene I just didn't know what it was. And then coming to the Third Line and seeing how intentional and how new it is from other gallery spaces, even globally, there was something that was quite comforting in that sense, and really inspirational. I think it took a while for me to find my feet here and feel honestly inspired by Dubai. And I think the Third Line was one of those places where I was like, okay, I can stay here.
Thank you so much. We've just asked Butena and Rami about some of their origin myths. I'd like to ask you, Sarah, about the origin myth of Studio Salazio. Where did it start, and how does it reflect this current moment, let's say 2025, which is certainly not 2005? So tell us a little bit about Studio Salazio, please.
So Studio Salazio is we like to call an experimental curatorial studio that Zainab Hassoun and I co-founded together, and it came from just many conversations over a couple of years, kind of being friends together and then going to shows together and then living in the UAE together, and really just observing, critiquing, reflecting on what art we are seeing here, and what art we're not seeing. So it really stemmed from that space of, okay, let's try to bring things that we would like to see, and work with artists that are maybe really kind of experimental in their craft and in their thinking, and also really representing kind of who we want to be. So I feel like it really stemmed from that, and it's been really great so far. We've done so much programming and exhibitions together, and really through critiquing and conversations. Yeah.
Thank you. And Sarah, Dazed MENA is turning 1 year old. You even got Bella Hadid on the front cover.
We did.
Mabruk. I mentioned that's how our generation, 20 years ago or so, was responding to 9/11, to the war on terror. I wanted to ask you, what world and what historical time is Dazed MENA finding itself born into, and how has this shaped its mission so far?
Well, I think the main historical moment that I feel we're, unfolding within is definitely October 7th, post-October 7th, and this moment of deep tragedy and uncertainty, but at the same time, this really intense hunger for narratives, youth narratives that are real, decolonial, and maybe less bound to, I think, identity or globally recognized signifiers of what our identities are supposed to be, not just regionally, but throughout the global majority. I think it's also a response to a lot of the rage we all feel, that we need to both sit with but let out. Dazed MENA, I think, is primarily a youth platform for youth. And I think what we've seen is, really this irritance with the way that maybe we've been covered in the past. I think it can sometimes be a little bit difficult for us to self-narrate within the right gaze, and we really wanted to subvert that, and really kind of follow, I think, what Muhammad al-Kurd often says about being perfect victims. We're only allowed to self-narrate when we stick within molds of being benevolent or good or peaceful, whatever that means. And I think we really wanted to just get away from these really tired binaries that are just so boring at this point, and cover a more vast terrain of narratives, and also go beyond the region itself, or MENA as you think of it. We always say, me and Ahmed, the boss, that Dazed MENA isn't so much bound to geography as much as, I think, MENA is a lens at which we look at the world that serves the global majority at large. And we kind of just try to follow that through line as much as possible, I think.
I mean, I just want to say, I think you've done an amazing job, and I want to give a round of applause to the first year of Dazed MENA, because, those of us who know Dazed London will know perhaps the sort of, the relationship that has had politically, and I think it's been quite extraordinary, and maybe many of us would have had, quite low hopes, right, given that background. But you set out on your own path with incredible kind of autonomy. Sarah, you're now curator at Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, which may well open late next year or the start of the year after. And it's interesting to note this. It's one of the timeline points here. It's some 20 years after it's first announced in, I believe, April 2006. When the third line opened, It may well have been the dream of many of its artists to be collected by MoMA New York or Pompidou Paris. Now, they may well prefer Sharjah Art Foundation or Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. The art review Power 100 2025 came out just a few days ago. Interestingly enough, 9 out of 10 of the top 10 are not white, and many are Gulf-based. Does it feel like the centers of gravity in the art world have truly shifted, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, big question, I think. But I do feel I sense a shift. You know, even just personally for myself, like not having grown up in the UAE and not having these big institutions here to visit or reference, and always looking towards Western institutions for sure. You know, that was always my point of reference and where I would find my art information from, rarely ever finding my own art history information from. And so now this total shift coming into Abu Dhabi with multiple museums opening in one district, also the kind of power that Asarkal has now also been growing into, and Art Dubai, and just the entire market of the region has exponentially shifted. And we can see that also like in other art market and like these big auction houses where we're making record regional, you know, sales. So that is undoubtedly, you know, caused a mega earthquake in the art world. And I would say that even working with artists that we're working with in the museum, the excitement is really there. The appreciation is there of, you know, kind of finally having, you know, this space that inshallah about to open soon, to become the new home, for not just artists, but also for people that live here and that are from here to come and visit as well. And it's about time, I would say, as well. Yeah.
I mean, as I say, I think one of the things that was driving me when I put this exhibition together, this project together, is the idea that these things that we're seeing now blossoming had their seeds planted 20 years ago. And it's quite accurate, you know, I mean, somewhere between 20 and 25 years ago, you could say, which is not to say there isn't a prehistory, of course, absolutely, but quite technically, no? As I say, the announcement of Saadiyat Island was in 2006. It's taken 20 years. Frank Gehry just sadly passed away, won't see the opening. But there's something, you know, I've often held in the past that it takes, things require 20 years to pass to become official history somehow. Although at the same time, I think decades don't take 10 years to happen anymore. They take 5 years or even 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. Sarah, over to you. I am a product of printed magazines. I think like Rami and Butena here, I was part of a magazine that Sunny co-founded with Lisa Farjam called Bidoon, which also celebrated its 20th anniversary last year. However, I do not consume magazines the same way that I used to then. I am on the same page as Robert Patterson, where he was trying to convince J-Law recently that he has a Gen Z brain, even though my body is tragically a Gen X body. Can you tell us why Dazed MENA is in print and why print still matters in a screen-saturated environment?
Well, I think Dazed MENA is in print, first of all, just by virtue of it being an extension of the Dazed brand, which very heavily revolves around print. I think on another level, I think print's magical in many ways. You know, you concretize so many different thoughts and bring so many different people together in one, I guess, memento that you can always turn to kind of break from the screen. And that is increasingly becoming a novelty that, you know, I do think we cherish. I think in terms of needing magazine and needing print, and this is maybe a more complex question for me, I'm not sure if we need magazines as much as we need spaces of and platforms of gathering where you can bring individuals, collectives together to expand, contest, disagree, agree, and so forth with ideas and kind of help critical thinking in whatever ways you can. I think the magazine as a format is an extension of this. I think we need those. And I think that is sort of a litmus test for how much we need print, as if it fulfills that criteria. I do think the magazine as a format, though, is rapidly changing, and even the way we think of print. I think magazines can exist now on Discord in certain ways, Instagram chat rooms, just as much as they can exist in homes. And so I gave this a more complicated answer, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And actually, Rami, I'd like to very quickly ask you here about The State, which was a magazine that you worked with a number of very key collaborators like Ahmed Makia and Rahel Aima. Could you tell us about that project? And I also just want to ask Butena about the sort of prognosis of traditional theater-based cinema. We're now at this moment where Warner Brothers is going to be bought either by Netflix or by the Oracle consortium. So, you know, we are, again, we're at another stage of this. It's a very natural timeline that runs thousands of years where, you know, previous media gets sort of supplanted by new media. But Rami, the importance of print back then versus, I don't know, how you consume, where do you mostly get your information these days?
Well, these days it's mainly Instagram, I'd say.
It's Instagram.
Instagram and a bit of people, but that's it. But back then, you were asking about
The State, yeah, because it was a very
It started off as a series of exhibitions with a publication that came with it. And so the first one was based on life post September 11th. And then the next one was on socialization. That was the one that we did here. And then one was around the coming insurrection related around the Arab Spring and so on. But then I started collaborating with Rahel and Ahmed on what we developed to be a socio-historical journal and forum. And so we brought out around 4 issues, and then the 5th one was a bit lighter. And each one spoke about a different subject, from like smell to one was about Dubai. And so, yeah, it was...
Okay, I now want to... we're in part 3 of our session today, the last part. I want to ask you about words, a very specific term here. Sarah, you did a master's in post-colonial culture at Goldsmiths University. And I'd like to ask you all in your respective spheres of practice whether this term post-colonial still means something, anything or nothing for you anymore. I have many feelings about this, but I'm going to keep them to myself. Butena, post-colonial, you know, it's been such an important category in cinema. You know, we've had the great tradition of post-colonial cinema. Is it a term that still means anything to you meaningfully?
I never think we arrived to the post. Like, we're still intra-colonial, you know, so, and that's true, you know, going back to your previous question. Like, I think also to what Sarah was saying, you know, I think ultimately it's not about the, you know, spaces per se. It's about the kind of the humanities that coexist in them and the visibility that renders them acceptable and safe. And I think, to me, that's what cinema, you know, is, and that's what at least we're striving to do with our spaces, whether it's pop-ups or, you know, our permanent locations. It's this idea that, you know, the acknowledgement, first of all, that even though we are engaged in this echo chamber, you know, of believing that we've arrived to a point where we have more cultural production around these conversations, that remains in the minority, you know, and it remains scarce, and it remains distorted, and it remains at war, you know. Like, I think that's the terrifying reality of it, right? Just because we have a festival called Real Palestine that has, you know, survived 12 editions, and, you know, filmmakers And I say this with absolute conviction, like Palestinian film is a miraculous, is a miracle witnessed every time because it's not supposed to exist, right? It's fought. And that's true about a lot of regional film. Like we're running the Fuji Short Film Festival now, and all shows are open to the public. And we also have Zainab Hassoun here, who's going to be moderating a conversation later today at 5 o'clock is the screenings. And these are films from the region, right? Like, so just because we have this festival of 2,000 submissions that we've received and people are making films, doesn't mean that this is the status quo or that it's allowed to happen. Like there is an absolute strife, whether it's existential, systemic, or physical and, political and corporal, that is a threat or at threat in the process of making these films and, shooting these works or creating those tracks or, writing those songs. And I think that's the reality of the spaces, that we engage with sometimes, especially in a place like Dubai. There is kind of things are derived, of their contexts and histories, and not context for the sake of context and nuance speak, right? Context for the sake of the filmmaker that we're showing today at 5 o'clock not getting a visa, so that he couldn't come from Iraq to show the film and speak to it, so he has to join us on Zoom. So these are the real things, that are still part of those worlds, that are still alive and well, and it's our duty as, space makers, creators, activators, to keep them alive with people and keep them alive with stories and keep them alive with honesty, and to sort of self-correct when we don't. So I really don't believe we're anywhere near that moment, of arrival. I'm glad you're having the conversation. I'm glad, your newest text, is as honest and is as forward. But I think the post, October 7th reality is just scratching the surface, of how ugly it's been and how ugly it is still, for the worlds that we're in, specifically, through my experience in cinema.
Thank you. And Sarah, since you did study post-colonial cultures, I'm sort of curious whether this is a term or an idea that feeds into conversations that, you and your colleagues at the Guggenheim have. Like, is this fuel? Is this something still alive when thinking about how to categorize art or how to kind of think about the world today?
100%. I think because of just the nature of the world and the histories that we're dealing with, we deal with art from around 1960s and onwards. And so this point in history is really looking at this post-colonial period, but now looking into methods of decolonization or decolonial methods of art making and art exhibiting as well, which all are contested terms, and we can go into a whole other conversation about that. But essentially, the way that we have built the curatorial narrative is really trying to break through those systems of categorization to really present a history of art that is in parallel with one another, and not happening kind of, in silos, and how they're all actually interconnected and interrelated, and I think that having a space to showcase that shared, collective, and universal experience of all of the things that we've been going through together, to find that moment of understanding, of healing, of reclaiming, or whatever that word even means. But yeah, it's something that is really threaded through, and I think even basing it in somewhere like here makes it even that much more important as well.
Thank you. Penultimate question for you, Sarah, so when I arrived here in 2005, exactly 20 years, it was the first week of December 2005, I was completely entranced by Dubai's obsession with the future. Then, arguably, somewhere along this timeline, the future became a thing of the past. You mentioned how Dazed MENA is very oriented, very youth-focused. I want to ask you whether you and quote unquote the youth that you represent in and participate in Dazed MENA, is there still a belief in the future? And is it a place, a time, or is it even a kind of hope anymore?
I feel like what I've noticed is that readers, and I think youth in general, have stopped, on the one hand, thinking about the future so much. There's this kind of almost disregard for thinking so ahead, but I think that stems from thinking about the future too much and feeling quite bleak and unable to visualize what it possibly could look like. And if we do, then being completely terrified of it or just nihilistic. And so then there's this move on the one hand to just live completely in the present or like provide the illusion that you are. And on the other hand, there's this really inspiring, I think, raising of political consciousness amongst youth, which I think very much kind of was seeded before October 7th and then now has come into full view, that is very future-based, you know. It stems from this kind of hope maxing that maybe we don't want to admit to ourselves, but that necessarily does consider the future as one that we could possibly like live in. And I think there's this word by, I think it's Emil Habib, which is like pessimism.
Yeah.
That I think very much captures the essence of, I think, how at least my youthful comrades feel. So yeah.
There was another word, I think, when Mamdani was elected on that day. You know, I think many people had many feelings. Maybe some people had more complicated feelings. But there was a term which came up that day, which was hope scrolling.
Yeah.
Which I really liked, which is, of course, the counter to doom scrolling, no? So we're used to doom scrolling.
Yeah.
But there was a sense in which let us allow ourselves to have one day, just one day of hope scrolling, you know?
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting. I want to, this is my last question for all of you. On the research wall outside is a list of every word of the year from 2005 to 2024. It's a very uncanny way to measure conscious reflections over time, from everything from the laughing, crying emoji to feminism to, I mean, it's a very interesting sort of deja vu. The words of the year for 2025 have mostly been revealed in the last weeks. So these are rage bait, 6-7, vibe coding, and most recently parasocial. Without giving it too much thought, instinctively, what would your word of the year for 2025 be? Rami Farouk, word of the year. Inshallah khair, thank you so much. Butena, word of the year? Hot take. Sarah?
Hope what?
Hope what? And Sarah.
Oh gosh, I'm having trouble now. There's too much things happening.
There are too many words of the year. Look, there should have only been one word of the year since October the 7th, and that's genocide. And the fact that it hasn't been the word of the year tells us everything. If it's not genocide, then the word of the year this year is slop. Absolutely. It's slop everything. So all of these dictionaries completely missed the point. We've run out of time. Before I thank our guests, I want to remind you all, please, that our catalog, our brand new catalog, is hot off the presses here in my hand. Please take a look at it outside, but also importantly, make your way upstairs to the shop. There is a whole merch line. I'm wearing some of it here. I'm wearing the socks here. There are posters, there are pencils, there are candles, there are cups. This is really where Sunny's kind of curatorial excitement kicked in. My only intervention was no tote bags. So there was a moratorium on tote bags. I did not want to add to the tote bag environmental crisis While we're there, downstairs, then turn left to see the last of the flash sales specials, which has over 30 works drawn from the archives around the theme of inner spaces. And I'm told that the gallery make a very good price for you. And with that, thank you all so much for being here. And join me in welcoming and thanking Rami, Michaela, Sarah, and Sarah. Thank you all very, 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 very much.